In 1860, for a woman in the slums of East London, a pregnancy was not a delicate secret kept in a parlor. It was a looming economic crisis that threatened the very survival of the household. For Mary, a young weaver in a massive textile mill, the first signs were felt as a heavy, rhythmic thrum in her bones. She felt the shift in her spirit while the factory roared around her. The roar of the machines drowned out her internal fears, but it could not hide the truth from her own body. This was a world of industrial transparency, where a woman's health was her only currency. There were no clinical tests, only the harsh reality of the physical self. She felt a profound weight in her limbs that the veteran workers called the draft of the mill. This was the first whisper of a child taking root in a world of soot and iron. For Mary, the announcement was not a sacred ritual with prayers, but a whispered conversation over a shared crust of bread in the dim light of a damp cellar. Her husband, a dock worker, looked at her with a mixture of love and deep, unspoken dread. A new mouth meant a tighter belt for all. The first physical trial was the morning sickness, known in the tenements as the bitter bile. In the Victorian city, the sensory world was a violent assault on the weak. The smell of open sewers and the thick coal smoke became sharp enemies to her stomach. She had to fight the urge to retch while the cotton dust filled her lungs. It was a battle of the will. There was no essence of mint or lavender to soothe her. She had to manage these waves of the alley while the foreman watched her every move. He was a sentinel of productivity, ready to dock her pay if she faltered for even a second. Every minute away from the loom was a penny lost from their survival fund. The management of her nausea became a feat of willpower. She masked her pale face with the gray dust of the floor to hide her condition. If she was seen as unfit, she would be replaced by tomorrow morning. Somnolence was a luxury she could never afford in the year 1860. A poor woman did not have a cool corner to rest in during the heat of the day. The fatigue was a physical wall she had to climb every morning. She worked until her legs swelled like tree trunks and her back felt like rusted iron. The management of her exhaustion was a daily ritual of stoic, weary endurance. She moved like a ghost through the gray London fog, her eyes fixed on the factory gates. It was believed by the upper classes that hard work kept the poor from falling into the pits of moral decay. This ideology meant she was expected to maintain her pace until the very day of the birth. Her only moments of quiet were in the restless sleep of a crowded bed shared with 3 other family members. The noise of the street never truly died away. It was a constant hum of urban struggle. Her dietary habits were governed strictly by the law of the penny. There were no sweet figs or cured meats for the weaver. She lived on a diet of weak tea, gray bread, and perhaps a bit of dripping. These were the cravings of the truly hungry, born from nutritional voids. She dreamed of a piece of fresh fruit or a clean egg, but such things were luxury myths told in the papers she used to block the cold drafts of the night. The management of her nutrition was a desperate calculation of survival. She often gave her own small portion of fat to her husband to keep him strong for the docks. She saw herself as the secondary engine of the house. Her body was a site of resource management, sacrificing her own vitality to ensure the family unit did not collapse into the workhouse of the city. In this gray world, every calorie was a weapon against the cold. She managed her breath to keep the cotton fibers from choking her. She managed her stride to save the soles of her only boots. Every day was a masterclass in survival. Mary was a silent architect of a future that felt impossible. She carried the weight of a new world within her exhausted iron spirit. As the middle of the pregnancy arrived, Mary moved deeper into the circle of the alley. In the Victorian slums, life was built on the foundation of mutual necessity. Pregnancy was the absolute domain of the neighborhood women. She spent her few free hours in the company of the wise woman of the street. They gathered to patch together the rag swaddle for the baby. They used old shirts and worn-out blankets discarded by the wealthy. They did not have fine linens or lace, only the remnants of a city that moved too fast to care. This was the mechanical preparation of the poor. The management of her physical comfort was a task for the sisterhood. As the city air was soot-filled, her mother would rub her skin with cheap lard for relief. This oily armor was the only way to prevent her skin from cracking under the strain of the growth. The wise woman's eye was her only form of medical surveillance. This woman was a veteran of 1,000 births in the dark. She used calloused hands to feel the position of the child through the fabric. She believed a hard face was the only sign of a true survivor. If Mary felt a languor of the spirit, there was no garden walk to restore her. She was told to stiffen her lip and keep moving. This was the architecture of hardship, built on the necessity of the daily wage. There was no room for fear, only for the cold logic of the next meal. Every discomfort had a rough remedy passed down through the generations of the local poor. A crust of burnt bread was used for the heartburn that plagued her nights. A sip of pennyroyal tea was used for the rhythmic cramps in her legs. They managed the body with the earth's leftovers and the wisdom of the desperate. The grandmother told stories of the great hunger from the old country. This instilled in Mary a sense of ancestral grit that no mill could break. She was part of a long chain of women who had birthed in the dark and raised children in the smoke. The geography of the home was a single corner of a crowded room. The family prepared for the birth by clearing a small space on the floor. It was a site of sacred, albeit gritty, intent. They could not afford fresh straw, so they used what they had at hand in the slum. They laid down old newspapers and birth clouts made from washed rags. This area was purified with a splash of cheap vinegar, the only disinfectant they could afford. The home was being prepared to receive a new mouth. The empire barely acknowledged her existence, but the women of the alley were her guard. Mary was taught the groans of the hearth by the elders. These were rhythmic sounds used to manage the rhythm of the labor without alerting the neighbors. She had to be quiet to not alert the landlord, as a noisy birth could lead to eviction. The cravings for specific foods were met with frustration and silence. If she desired something beyond bread, she had to wait for the Sunday scraps from the local butcher shop. Satisfying these desires was a dream that rarely came true in the cold reality of 1860. The entire tenement conspired to keep the peace of the hungry. They shared what little they had to support her journey. One neighbor brought a bit of coal. Another brought a clean rag. This was the social capital of the poor. No conflict was allowed to reach her tired heart. Bitter blood was thought to spoil the milk, so they protected her mood with stories and humor. She was a soldier in a war of attrition against the slums. She prepared for an ancient battle in a room that smelled of damp walls and unwashed life. The midwife was a neighbor who took no fee but a bit of gin. She prepared her bundle of mercy for the night of the birth. She stood at the window, watching the soot fall like snow. She managed the heat of the single candle to make it last through the mending. She was the manager of a tiny, brave kingdom of rags. Every stitch was a prayer for the child's strength. She was ready to cross the threshold into motherhood, anchored by the iron bonds of the women who stood behind her now. The hour of the threshold arrived in the dead of night, just as the factory whistles fell silent. When the first signs began, the atmosphere of the cellar changed instantly. The men and children were sent out into the cold alley to wait. The interior became a sovereign female space. It was lit by a single tallow candle and the dying embers of a small coal fire. The wise woman arrived at last, the navigator of the smoke. She brought the wisdom of the scars and the scent of gin. There was no anesthesia in the slums of the 19th century. Relief came only from the strength of the spirit and the logic of the floor. The midwife encouraged Mary to pull on a birth rope tied to a bedpost. They believed gravity was a partner. The body had to remain in motion to find its way through the fire. Mary was an active participant in her own survival. The management of pain was a communal groan. She was never alone. She was supported by the pillars of the slum. They sat behind her, creating a human chair of grit. They breathed with her, matching her rhythm in a dance of endurance and power. When the pain reached its peak, the women began the shield of noise. They sang raucous street songs and low hymns to drown out her cries. This auditory management kept the landlord from knocking at the door. She was anchored by the voices of those who had survived the same fire. The midwife used warm rags soaked in vinegar to soothe her back and keep her focused. This was the sisterhood of the threshold, a bond that ignored the grime of the walls. The sanctity of the room was absolute and enforced by the elder women. No one was allowed to enter who did not understand the fire of birth. The midwife watched the signs of the body with a keen eye. She knew when to urge Mary forward. She was the conductor of a biological rebellion. The struggle was seen as a labor of the bone, the ultimate tax of the soul. Every woman present contributed her strength to the cause. Silence was a luxury they could not afford. The only goal was the arrival of the breath. As the child drew near, the midwife prepared a basin of water. The logic of the slum dictated that life was hard, and the child must be met with it. The tension in the room reached a crescendo of breath. Every woman held her breath as the miracle unfolded. They were witnesses to the continuity of the poor in a world that wanted to forget them. The cry of the gutter finally broke the silence of the room. The midwife caught the child with hands that were rough but certain. The relief was a physical wave. It washed over the damp walls and the tired faces. The child was washed and rubbed with a bit of lard to protect the skin from the biting cold. This was the arrival of the burden, a new life that would soon join the thrum of the spinning mill. The child was wrapped in rags and newspapers for warmth. The mother was given a sip of cheap gin to restore her vital heat. She had crossed the threshold and returned as a matriarch of the tenement. Her status was changed forever. She was now a life giver. The midwife called the husband from the alley. The news was greeted with a sigh of relief from the street. The management of the event was over. Inside, the women remained in a quiet triumph over the shadows of the Victorian night. They cleaned the floor with the same vinegar they used for purification. The room was restored to its status as a home, but the air was different now. It was filled with the promise of a new generation. Mary looked at her child and saw a spark in the dark. The midwife stayed for an hour to manage the flow of the blood and ensure the mother was safe from the fever. She rubbed Mary's tired feet with the remaining oil. She managed the first latch of the infant with a master's touch. The darkness of the cellar felt like a fortress now. They had survived the threshold. The management of the night was a victory of the spirit. Mary closed her eyes, holding the child close, the smell of wood smoke and hope filling her exhausted lungs. Following the birth, the poor woman entered a period of fragile rest. In the Victorian era, sacred separation was a fantasy reserved for the elite. She was lucky if she could stay on her mat for 3 days. The management of her recovery was a race against hunger. She did not have 40 days to heal. Her world was the sanctuary of the corner, a gift from her neighbors. It allowed her spirit to adjust while the wolf of hunger waited at the door. Her mother took over her shift at the mill, working double time to keep Mary's place on the floor. This was the season of the scraps. Her dietary management was a desperate attempt to keep her milk flowing. She was fed gruel of the poor, watered down oats and a bit of lard for strength. Her sisters brought her water from the communal pump, risking the cholera that lived in the pipes. The goal was to replenish the milk of the mill. Her nutrition was the foundation of the child's survival. Somnolence was a fleeting dream she could only catch in snatches. She lived in the rhythm of the factory whistle, waking to the sound of the city every hour. The noise of the street was constant and unforgiving. The grandmother would sit by the mat, managing the education of the mother. She taught her how to hush the hungry when there was no food to give. This was the oral library of the tenement. The mother was learning the logic of the hardened heart. The nursery was a wooden crate padded with washed rags for comfort. The mother kept the child close to her skin to keep them warm. This intense proximity was the only way to manage the infant's security. In 1860, the mother's heat was the only fire the child had. Do you have a story of an ancestor who survived against the odds? Share it in the comments below. This rest was a time of refinement of the grit for the young mother. She reflected on the life she had brought into the smoke. She was the gardener of a weed, a soul that would have to grow in the cracks of the pavement. The scent of the sanctuary was one of coal gas and damp wool. The house was a temple of survival. The mother spent her days in anxious passivity. She allowed her body to heal as fast as it possibly could under the strain. Every woman who visited brought a coin of comfort or a kind word. As the few days of rest ended, she prepared for her return to the loom. She washed her face and tied her apron tight. This was the restoration of the wage earner. She had moved through the valley of the shadow and was ready to reclaim her station. She was no longer a girl. She was a guardian of bread. This period was the foundation of her future authority in the family. The management of her recovery was a success if she could stand without fainting. She was a link in the chain of the poor, a bridge to a new future. She felt the weight of the loom calling her back in her dreams, but she would never be the same. The rest had transformed her into a true protector. She understood the economics of the soul and the cost of a breath. She was ready to face the soot once more. She was the captain of a fragile soul. The internal sanctuary would remain with her even in the factory. The management of the child's care while she worked was a new hurdle. She would have to pay a neighbor a penny to watch the baby during her long shift. This was a grim choice of management. She decided to trust her mother. The family would manage the child in shifts. This was the logistics of the poor in full effect. Every morning she would feed the child and then walk to the mill. Her body was still sore, but her spirit was iron. The management of her pain was a silent prayer as she walked through the mud. She kept her eyes fixed on the factory chimney. She was working for more than just herself now. She was working for the survival of the next generation. At the factory, the foreman looked at her with a cold eye. He only asked if she could keep the pace. She took her place at the loom, the roar of the machines her song. She was a mother, and the world belonged to her. The final act was the presentation of the child at the parish church. The mother carried the child through the muddy streets. They offered no gold, only a few pennies they had scraped together with great effort. This was the public seal on the private struggle. It was the moment the child became a subject of the Queen. The child was officially named in the book. This marked the arrival of the social soul. The management of the memory began on this day. The details of the enjus and the cravings were added to the oral history of the house. She would tell these stories to the child as they grew. She ensured they knew the price of their breath. The child's identity was rooted in the struggle of the mother and the alley. This narrative management was how values were passed down in the slums. The child was taught they were the result of a labor of iron and love. The legacy of these Victorian mothers is one of resilience. They lived in a world of hardship, yet they created a sanctuary of love. They did not have the gilded cage, but they had the strength of the street and the heart. The cycle of the alley was eternal. Mary would one day become the grandmother in the same room. She would stand by the mat of her own daughter. She would pass down the secrets of the wise woman. This endless loop of care was the true power of the working class. It was a world governed by grit and necessity. The somnolence of the rest was the price paid for life. The mother looked at her child and saw a future survivor of the great city. She had managed the threshold and won her war. Thank you for traveling back to 1860 with us. By understanding these struggles, we honor the human condition. The light of the coal fire still shines in our history. We see their courage in every soul that refuses to be broken by the world. They remind us that the management of the family is the most sacred task of all humanity. Wealth does not determine the value of a mother's labor. The door of the tenement closes. The child sleeps in a crate. The story of life continues. The soot falls, but the song of the hearth echoes in the rafters. The logic of the floor remains our guide through the darkness. We learn from the past to manage the present. The mothers of the slums were the true pioneers of the human soul. They traded their ease for a future they could only hope for. Their life was a symbolic performance of faith and endurance. They were the most powerful figures in their world. They held the future in their trembling, blackened hands against the soot. We see their faces in the grit of every mother who fights for her child. Their victory is our victory. The cycle of the hearth is the heartbeat of all humanity. In the end, Mary returned to the mill every day. Her hands were calloused, but her heart was full. She knew the child was the spark in the dark. She would protect that spark with everything she had in her. The history of the poor is written in sweat and love. We honor that history today. Their legacy is the strength we carry forward. The end of the story is just a new beginning. She taught the child to read by the light of the fire. She managed his education as carefully as she managed the loom. She wanted him to escape the shadow of the mill for a better life. This was her ultimate goal of management. She was a visionary in a world of soot. She saw a world where her son could be more than a weaver. This vision was her internal light. As she grew older, Mary became the wise woman of her own street. She helped the next generation of mothers. She passed down the logic of the floor to those who came after her. She looked at the rising sun over the docks. She managed the heavy water bucket with a practiced grip. The child was safe. The legacy was secure. She was the mother of the future, a silent queen in the empire of the poor. She breathed the gray air of London, knowing that within her, she carried the fire of 1,000 generations. The story remains, etched in the soot.